The airport buzzed with activity, a steady hum of voices, rolling suitcases, and the occasional announcement echoing over the speakers. Travelers hurried along the smooth tile floors, some rushing to catch flights, others already slumped in the chairs of waiting areas, lost in their phones or magazines. Among the crowd, Sarah Miller stood out, not because she was different in any glaring way, but because her presence went largely unnoticed, at least by the people who mattered. Dressed in a simple, faded denim jacket, her pants slightly wrinkled from the long train ride to the airport, and carrying a well-worn suitcase that had seen better days, Sarah didn't fit the profile of the typical first-class traveler. Her clothing, while functional, was far from the designer brands flaunted by those around her. She adjusted the strap of her bag as she moved to the check-in counter, her heart beating steadily in her chest. A long flight was ahead, but it wasn't the destination that worried her, it was the journey itself. When she approached the counter, Brad, the ticket agent, glanced up from his screen and immediately took in her appearance with a slight sneer. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he looked her up and down. It was a quick judgment, one that he didn't feel the need to hide. "First time flying first class?" Brad asked with a condescending chuckle, leaning slightly forward, as though his words were a private joke. Sarah blinked, surprised by the question but not rattled by it. She merely nodded, her voice calm as she replied, "I believe so." "Well, it's a little unconventional," Brad remarked, his eyes scanning the check-in system again, though his tone remained dripping with sarcasm. "You sure you're not in the wrong line?" Sarah didn't respond right away. She handed him her boarding pass and waited as he entered the information into the system. His fingers clacked across the keys faster than necessary, clearly eager to get the interaction over with. There was something about him that made Sarah uneasy, but she didn't let it show. Brad handed her the ticket with a dismissive gesture. "Economy, of course," he said, as though the word itself was a verdict. "You'll have to go through security, same as everyone else." He didn't even bother to look up from his screen. As Sarah moved away from the counter, the dismissive stares of other passengers followed her like an invisible weight. She could feel their eyes, judging, measuring, wondering what she was doing in such a well-heeled crowd. A few whispered behind her back, their voices muffled but still sharp enough to catch her attention. "She doesn't look like she belongs here," a woman in a business suit muttered to her companion. Sarah walked on, choosing not to engage. There was no reason to acknowledge their assumptions. She entered the waiting area, found her gate, and settled into a chair near the far side of the room. It was the same chair that all the other economy passengers had claimed. Everyone around her was deep in their own worlds, either glued to their phones or watching the constant stream of people heading to their flights. Sarah's gaze shifted toward the flight display board as her thoughts wandered, but she didn't try to interact with anyone. Her place in the world was clear to her. She was a passenger, like everyone else. A person who was used to being overlooked. The boarding announcement crackled over the speakers, and a wave of movement surged through the gate area. Sarah stood and walked toward the line with the other economy class passengers, who were already starting to form a queue. She moved with quiet purpose, but as she passed the first-class line, the stares intensified. The same passengers who had watched her walk in now watched her move forward, clearly confused by her presence. She presented her boarding pass without a second thought, and the gate attendant's eyebrows lifted in surprise. He scanned the ticket and handed it back without comment. Sarah continued down the jetway, walking at a steady pace, the noise of the crowd becoming more distant. When she entered the plane, the contrast between the sleek first-class section and the cramped economy area was immediately obvious. The well-dressed passengers in first class were already settled into their plush seats, the fine fabrics of their clothing stark against the stark lighting of the jetway. But Sarah's seat was in the back, nestled among the others who were equally as ordinary as she appeared. She nodded politely to the flight attendants as she passed them, her eyes scanning the cabin for her row. Once she found her seat, she lowered herself into it, glancing over at the passengers seated next to her. They barely acknowledged her, their eyes glued to the small screens in front of them. She didn't mind. Sarah was used to being unnoticed. But what struck her was the sense of discomfort that lingered, not just with the other passengers, but with the crew. They too seemed to look right past her. And then, as if on cue, a voice from behind her spoke with a mix of mockery and curiosity. "Nice suitcase. I didn't know they still made those at thrift stores." It was a woman's voice, loud enough for the passengers around Sarah to hear, and it sent a ripple of uncomfortable laughter through the cabin. Sarah's hand tightened around the armrest, but she didn't respond. There was no point in reacting. She had dealt with worse in her time. The laugh faded, and the conversation drifted to other things. But the sense of isolation remained. Sarah looked out the window, her gaze steady. She wasn't a person to draw attention to herself, not even in the face of mockery. Her job wasn't about impressing others. It was about doing what was right. And for now, the job required patience. The plane began to taxi, and Sarah closed her eyes, bracing herself for the long flight ahead. She knew her work wasn't over yet. There would be time for everything to unfold. But for now, she was just a quiet woman in the back of a plane, a woman whose true identity no one yet understood. And that would make all the difference. The plane hummed steadily as it ascended, cutting through the clouds with a gentle, rhythmic motion. Sarah had already closed her eyes, settling into her seat as though she were a part of the aircraft itself. She wasn't one to fidget or fumble. Her calm presence had been shaped over years of training and experience. The low chatter of passengers and the occasional sound of the seatbelt sign flashing off did little to disturb her. She knew the flight was going to be long, and she wasn't in any rush to arrive. It was the journey itself that mattered. In the rows around her, conversations flickered on and off, some about business deals, others about vacation plans. There was the man across the aisle discussing his once-in-a-lifetime trip to a remote beach, and the woman beside him casually comparing airline services. A flight attendant, Jack, passed by and smiled politely but with a certain air of superiority, as if he could see Sarah for the first time, standing there in the aisle with the weight of responsibility. At the front of the plane, the crew was busy with their standard duties, making sure seatbelts were fastened and safety instructions were being followed, though some of their attention was already drifting. The captain's voice came over the intercom, a smooth baritone assuring everyone that they would reach cruising altitude in no time. Sarah sat with her laptop open in front of her, her fingers gliding across the keys with ease, unnoticed by most. To the casual observer, she was just another passenger passing time in a sterile cabin. But to the sharp-eyed crew, there was something unsettling about her calm, poised demeanor. An hour into the flight, the turbulence began. At first, it was subtle, a small jolt, the kind of vibration that made some of the passengers glance around nervously, tightening their grip on the armrests. But it didn't take long for the slight shaking to turn into a more intense tremor. The plane bounced in the air, swaying side to side as if it were caught in a turbulent storm. The overhead compartments rattled, and a few of the passengers gasped, their faces stricken with uncertainty. The seatbelt sign flickered on. From her position, Sarah could hear the frantic murmurs from the passengers around her, the tension rising. One woman gripped her armrest tightly, her knuckles turning white, while a man across the aisle tried to comfort his child, offering whispered assurances. The crew, at first composed, now hurried up and down the aisles, exchanging quick glances as they adjusted their positions. Tim, a young flight attendant who had been with the airline for less than a year, looked more frazzled than anyone. His hands shook slightly as he reached up to the overhead compartments, attempting to secure them as the turbulence intensified. It was then that the emergency light flickered on. The low hum of the plane's machinery became erratic, and the warning light flashed a stark red, signaling that something was wrong with the aircraft. The attendants froze for a moment, unsure of how to handle the situation. Some of the passengers began to whisper anxiously. Sarah glanced up, noticing Tim's flustered movements. His face was pale, his brows furrowed in confusion as he pressed buttons on the control panel above the seats. His efforts were clumsy, ineffective. Nothing seemed to change. The crew began to exchange worried looks, and the panic in the cabin began to grow. The captain's voice came over the intercom, trying to reassure the passengers, but even his calm tone seemed to do little to quell the rising tide of fear. Sarah stood up from her seat with quiet resolve, gathering her laptop from the tray table and slipping it into her bag with practiced ease. She walked calmly down the aisle toward the front of the plane, her movements steady and deliberate as the turbulence rocked the aircraft. The flight attendants barely noticed her at first, too focused on the flashing emergency lights. But when Sarah reached Tim, she didn't hesitate. "Here, let me help," she said softly, her voice barely rising above the noise of the plane. Tim turned to her, his wide eyes flashing with a mix of surprise and desperation. I don't know what's happening. It won't reset, the system's gone haywire. We need to figure out what's wrong or—" His voice cracked slightly. Sarah's gaze remained steady, unflinching. "Step aside," she instructed calmly, her tone that of someone used to solving high-pressure problems. Tim hesitated for a moment before taking a half-step back. Sarah didn't waste time. She moved to the control panel and began pressing the buttons with practiced precision. Her fingers moved with the exactness of someone who had handled these kinds of emergencies before. It was clear to anyone watching that Sarah wasn't just a regular passenger. She wasn't a nervous flyer, either. As Sarah worked, the crew exchanged glances, their earlier assumptions about her now slipping away. Some of the passengers had begun to take notice of the way Sarah was handling the situation. The young flight attendant, Emma, had been watching intently from the back of the cabin. She was familiar with how these systems operated but had never seen someone work so swiftly, so methodically. With a final press of a button, Sarah stepped back. The emergency light turned off. The turbulence began to subside, and the cabin returned to a calm that seemed almost surreal in comparison to the moments before. Tim looked at her, his face filled with both awe and embarrassment. "Thank you. I had no idea what to do." Sarah smiled faintly, her voice quiet but firm. "It's okay. It happens." She turned back toward her seat, not waiting for further acknowledgement. She didn't need it. As she sat down, her gaze drifted over to the passengers, some of whom were still recovering from the shock. A few were whispering among themselves, trying to make sense of the calm figure who had just solved the crisis. Tim, still standing at the front, took a deep breath and spoke to the crew, his voice tinged with newfound respect. I think we've got it under control now." He paused, glancing toward Sarah. "Thanks to her." As Sarah settled back into her seat, she noticed Emma standing at the back of the cabin, watching her. There was no mistaking the recognition in Emma's eyes. She knew now. Sarah's laptop, her calm demeanor, and the efficiency with which she had resolved the problem, it all pointed to one thing. She was no ordinary passenger. The seatbelt sign flickered off, and the plane resumed its course, but the quiet ripple of respect that had begun to spread through the cabin didn't fade. The passengers, the crew, and even Sarah herself understood one thing now. The flight had just taken a turn. And it wasn't going to be what anyone expected. The atmosphere on the plane shifted subtly but unmistakably. It wasn't just the turbulence that had caused the tension earlier, it was the sudden realization that Sarah was no ordinary passenger. The flight attendants had whispered among themselves, and the passengers had begun to cast sideways glances toward her. They had seen her handle the emergency with unshakable calm, but what really unsettled them was the logo she had glimpsed on her laptop. Emma, the young flight attendant who had watched Sarah with growing curiosity, stood at the back of the cabin, her mind racing. The more she thought about it, the more she was convinced that Sarah wasn't just a passenger, she was someone important. She had recognized the faint insignia on the corner of the laptop. It was subtle, but Emma knew it well. The Federal Aviation Administration. It had taken a moment for Emma to piece it together. But now, the pieces fell into place. Sarah's quick thinking, her ability to resolve the problem with the malfunctioning equipment, the composed way she carried herself, it all pointed to one thing. Sarah wasn't just traveling like the rest of the passengers. She was on the job. Emma felt a wave of nervous excitement wash over her. She had to know for sure. But she also didn't want to risk exposing herself. After all, if Sarah was who Emma thought she was, then the entire flight might be under surveillance. Everything could change in a heartbeat. A few minutes passed. Sarah had returned to her seat, resuming her quiet presence as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. The turbulence had subsided, and the cabin's energy had returned to something resembling normal. But the whispers hadn't stopped entirely. Passengers were still looking at Sarah, trying to make sense of what they'd just witnessed. "Did you see what she did?" One passenger murmured to another. She just stepped up and fixed the system like she knew exactly what she was doing. I think she's part of the crew, another passenger speculated. Maybe a backup flight attendant or something. But the comments didn't match the reality. Sarah wasn't a part of the crew, and everyone in the cabin could feel that. Emma moved cautiously up the aisle, approaching Sarah's row. She stopped just beside her seat, pretending to check the overhead compartments. She glanced down at Sarah, who seemed completely unaware of the eyes watching her. After a moment, Emma cleared her throat and smiled gently. "Excuse me, ma'am," Emma said, her voice low but polite. "I couldn't help but notice the logo on your laptop. Are you with the FAA?" Sarah looked up, her eyes meeting Emma's for the first time. For a brief second, Sarah's expression softened, and then her lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Why do you ask?" Sarah replied quietly, her tone cool but not unfriendly. Emma hesitated, but her curiosity got the best of her. I thought I recognized it. The FAA. I've worked with the airline industry for a few years, and I've seen that logo before." Sarah didn't respond right away, and Emma started to second-guess her approach. Had she overstepped? Was it too obvious? But then Sarah spoke again, her voice just above a whisper, enough for Emma to hear clearly but not for anyone else to catch. "Yes, I'm with the FAA," Sarah confirmed, her calmness never wavering. "I'm the chief inspector." The words landed like a bombshell, but Sarah's delivery was so understated that Emma wasn't sure if anyone else had heard. Still, her heart skipped a beat. She'd suspected it, but to hear it out loud, officially, was a different matter entirely. Emma nodded slowly, trying to keep her composure. I had a feeling," she said quietly, trying to act casual. "It makes sense now that I think about it. The way you handled everything. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." Sarah gave her a small smile, one that almost seemed to say, "I understand." She glanced around the cabin, where the passengers were still lost in their own worlds. "It's fine," Sarah replied. "I'd rather you ask than keep wondering." Emma blinked in surprise. She had been ready for Sarah to brush her off or give her a more evasive answer. But instead, Sarah was speaking to her as though they were colleagues, two people who understood the importance of discretion. "Are you investigating the flight?" Emma asked, a hint of concern creeping into her voice. It seemed like a strange question to ask, but the unease that had settled into the back of her mind wouldn't let go. Sarah paused for a moment before answering, her voice still as measured and controlled as ever. "Let's just say I'm here to observe. Sometimes, people don't realize how much is under the surface." She looked directly at Emma, her gaze sharp yet calm. "I don't take things lightly." Emma, now more intrigued than ever, stepped back and gave Sarah a slight nod. There was an understanding between them, an unspoken agreement that this conversation was not for the other passengers' ears. "Understood," Emma said, her tone now respectful. She lingered for a second before moving back toward the rear of the plane, her mind spinning with the implications of what she'd just learned. As she walked down the aisle, she noticed the crew members, Jack and Rachel, speaking in hushed tones. They, too, had noticed Sarah's calm presence, but unlike Emma, they hadn't figured out the truth yet. They still looked at Sarah with a mix of confusion and disdain. How could someone like her be in charge? They had no idea who they were dealing with. Meanwhile, Sarah remained where she was, her eyes now focused on the flight path displayed on her screen. She was doing what she did best, observing. She had seen all the signs of a flight crew that had grown complacent. The turbulence, the emergency light malfunction, the way the crew had fumbled under pressure. It wasn't just coincidence. It was negligence. Her eyes drifted to the other passengers, their conversations slowly fading into the background. The ones who had mocked her earlier were now silent. The respect that had been missing moments ago was beginning to settle into the air. And as Sarah settled back into her seat, her thoughts turned to the next step. Her mission had only just begun. And now, the real work would start. The plane cruised steadily at its optimal altitude, the low hum of the engines becoming a soothing background to the silence that had descended over the cabin. The earlier turbulence had passed, and the crew, although still visibly unsettled by Sarah's presence, resumed their duties with an air of professionalism that hadn't been present before. Sarah, meanwhile, continued to sit in her seat, her attention fixed on the screen in front of her. But her thoughts were far from the in-flight movie. She was observing, watching the crew, the passengers, the behavior of everyone on board. Her role as an FAA inspector wasn't just about checking safety measures. It was about understanding the human element, the little things that could so easily be overlooked, the subtle signs of negligence or complacency that could put an entire flight at risk. It was evident now that the crew hadn't been performing at their best. Tim had struggled with the malfunctioning equipment, and it wasn't just because he was new. There was something deeper, something that suggested a lack of attention to detail, a laxity that could eventually lead to a more serious issue if it went unchecked. Sarah didn't need to hear the murmurs to know what the crew was thinking. She could feel their unease in the air, as palpable as the tension from earlier. It wasn't just about the emergency light or the turbulence. It was about the looming presence of someone who saw beyond their carefully constructed facade. Her gaze shifted to the front of the plane, where Jack and Rachel, the senior flight attendants, were now conversing quietly. Their words were hushed, but the occasional glance toward Sarah told her all she needed to know. They were starting to put the pieces together. They were beginning to wonder if she had been observing them all along. As Sarah continued her quiet vigil, she caught Emma's eye once more. The young flight attendant was now walking back down the aisle, glancing over her shoulder as though unsure whether to approach Sarah again. Emma's curiosity was growing, and Sarah could see that. The girl was sharp. She had recognized Sarah's role without needing confirmation. And in some ways, Sarah appreciated that. Emma stopped near Sarah's row, this time standing with her hands clasped in front of her. She hesitated for a moment, then spoke quietly, "I never would have guessed, the way you handled the situation back there. You didn't even flinch." Sarah turned her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "It's part of the job," she said softly, her voice low enough that only Emma could hear. "Sometimes, the best way to handle a crisis is to stay calm. Panicking doesn't help anyone." Emma nodded, her admiration evident. "I saw it. The logo on your laptop. And the way you fixed everything. I can't even imagine how many things you must have caught on this flight already." Sarah paused, her gaze lingering on Emma. "A lot," she said, her tone carrying a weight of experience. "But not everything needs to be fixed in an instant. Sometimes, the worst issues are the ones no one even notices." She glanced at the crew, who were now starting to go through the motions of their duties, their earlier awkwardness slowly giving way to a hesitant professionalism. People get complacent. They stop paying attention. And that's when things go wrong. Emma looked at Sarah for a moment, clearly processing what she was hearing. The subtle acknowledgement in her eyes told Sarah that Emma was beginning to understand the true scope of her role. "I guess that's why you're here, huh?" Emma finally said, her voice quieter than before. Sarah gave her a small, knowing smile. "Something like that." With a final glance at the crew, Emma stepped back, moving toward the front of the cabin once more. Her thoughts were clearly elsewhere now. She had seen enough to understand that this flight wasn't as straightforward as it had first seemed. And it wasn't just about the passengers or the crew, it was about something deeper. Something that was unfolding with every passing minute. The rest of the flight passed quietly, the hum of the engines filling the air as passengers settled in, the crew's unease slowly ebbing away. Sarah watched it all. Their movements, the way they interacted with each other, the way the plane shifted and rocked ever so slightly as they flew through the sky. To anyone else, it would have seemed like just another routine flight. But Sarah knew better. By the time the plane began its descent, the crew had resumed their routines, but it was clear that they were no longer operating with the same arrogance they had earlier. Jack, once so confident, was now moving carefully, double-checking everything he did. Rachel, too, had adopted a more measured approach, her sharp eyes scanning the cabin with renewed vigilance. The subtle changes in their behavior weren't lost on Sarah. It was almost like the weight of her presence had settled into them, like they were now aware of her watchful eyes, constantly measuring their every move. And Sarah wasn't about to let them off the hook. She had seen enough to know that the crew wasn't perfect. But perfection wasn't what she was looking for. It was the awareness, the attention to detail, and the commitment to doing the right thing, even when no one was watching, that mattered. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, the captain's voice came over the intercom, assuring passengers that they had arrived safely at their destination. The crew began to prepare for disembarkation, but for Sarah, the job wasn't over yet. She knew that the real work was about to begin. The passengers began to gather their things, but Sarah stayed seated for a moment longer. She wasn't in a rush. Her mind was already running through the list of observations she had made during the flight, the behavior of the crew, the subtle signs of complacency, the moments of doubt in the passengers' eyes. It wasn't enough to simply document the issues. She had to make sure they were addressed. And that would take more than just a report. It would take action. The plane came to a complete stop at the gate, and the seatbelt sign flashed off. Passengers began to stand, but Sarah didn't move. She was waiting for the moment that would change everything. As she unbuckled her seatbelt, her gaze fell on the crew. They were still talking among themselves, no longer dismissive of each other, but there was something else now, a tension, an awareness that hadn't been there before. And as Sarah stood up to exit, she caught Emma's eye one last time. The younger flight attendant nodded subtly, as though she too understood that things weren't as they seemed. For the crew of this flight, it wasn't over. The FAA inspection had only just begun. As the plane came to a halt at the gate and the passengers began to rise from their seats, there was a noticeable shift in the cabin's energy. Gone was the casual chatter and the calm routine of a normal flight. Instead, the crew moved more cautiously, exchanging fleeting looks as they prepared to assist passengers off the plane. It was as if a cloud of tension hung over them, the weight of Sarah's presence still hanging in the air. Sarah stood up slowly, collecting her belongings with deliberate movements. Her calm, measured actions contrasted with the fidgeting and the hurried manner of the passengers around her, who were eager to leave the aircraft. She could hear the murmurs as people speculated about what had really happened earlier. Some of them must have figured it out. After all, Sarah hadn't just fixed the malfunctioning equipment. She had done so with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. But to most, she was just a quiet woman, blending into the crowd, fading into the background once again. And that suited Sarah just fine. She wasn't here for recognition or gratitude. Her mission had been clear from the moment she boarded the plane. Observe, assess, and report. Nothing more, nothing less. As she walked down the aisle toward the exit, her gaze lingered for a moment on the crew. Jack, the senior flight attendant, was standing near the front of the plane, giving instructions to the remaining passengers in an overly formal tone, his earlier cockiness gone. Rachel, too, seemed more composed, but the tightness around her eyes suggested she was still on edge. Emma, who had exchanged knowing glances with Sarah earlier, stood at the back of the cabin, her eyes following Sarah with an almost imperceptible look of respect. It wasn't lost on Sarah that the crew was acting like they were under a microscope, as though every move they made was being watched. The subtle shift in their behavior told her everything she needed to know. They were already aware of the impact she had made, even if they didn't know exactly who she was. Once Sarah exited the plane and walked down the jet bridge, she made her way toward the small office near the gate where FAA inspectors usually waited. She had already sent an email to the central office, detailing the observations she had made during the flight. Her notes were thorough, every little detail, every moment of hesitation from the crew, every sign of complacency. But the report was just the beginning. The real work would come later, when the investigation began. Sarah entered the office and approached a colleague sitting at a desk, who was just finishing up a report. The man looked up as she entered, his expression shifting from neutral to slightly surprised. "Sarah," he said with a nod. "We weren't expecting you back so soon." She gave him a small smile. "I didn't expect to be back so soon either, but I needed to document some things." Her tone was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a clear sense of purpose. "What happened?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. Sarah placed the report she had been working on in front of him. "Skylux Airlines. Flight 207, she began, her voice low but steady. "There's a lot that needs attention. The crew especially. They've become complacent. They don't understand the gravity of their responsibilities." Her colleague flipped through the pages of the report quickly, his eyes scanning the notes she had made. His eyebrows furrowed as he read. "You're saying the crew was negligent? What in particular?" "Everything," Sarah replied bluntly. "The crew was unprepared for even the smallest issues. The malfunctioning emergency light. The turbulence. They panicked. Tim was clearly overwhelmed, and Jack and Rachel, despite being senior, didn't step in to help properly. They had no control over the situation. This wasn't just one mistake, it's a pattern." Her colleague looked up at her, his expression hardening. "Sounds like we've got a problem on our hands." Sarah nodded. "It's more than a problem. It's a safety risk." He let out a slow breath. "What do you want to do?" "The airline needs to be grounded," she said firmly. "At least for 48 hours. That'll give us enough time to conduct a thorough investigation. If we let this go unchecked, it'll only escalate." Her colleague sighed but didn't argue. He knew how seriously Sarah took these matters. "All right, I'll start the paperwork. This won't be easy for Skylux, but it needs to be done." Meanwhile, back on the plane, as passengers began to disembark, the crew was still working in a tense, almost robotic fashion. Jack, despite his attempts at professionalism, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He hadn't yet pieced together what had happened during the flight, but he couldn't deny the fact that he and his team had faltered. The flight had been smooth, but the crew had struggled. Rachel approached him, her face a mix of concern and curiosity. "Do you think she saw through us?" she asked quietly. "Who?" Jack muttered, trying to keep his voice low, but it carried in the quiet of the emptying cabin. "Her," Rachel said, glancing subtly in the direction of Sarah's empty seat. "The woman. She knew what we were doing, or rather, not doing." Jack hesitated. He didn't want to admit it, but something in the way Sarah handled the emergency had made him feel small. "Maybe," he muttered. "But she's just a passenger. We'll be fine." But Rachel wasn't so sure. "I don't know, Jack. There's something about her. I haven't been able to shake the feeling that we missed something big." She paused, looking at her colleague closely. "And now I'm wondering if she's already reported us." Jack stiffened. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. They had always gotten away with the little things, the half-hearted safety checks, the lack of attention to detail, but now, the nagging suspicion that Sarah had been documenting their every move started to sink in. And if she had reported them, the consequences could be dire. Back in the FAA office, Sarah sat quietly at her desk, waiting for the formal investigation to begin. The airline had already been notified, and the CEO of Skylux Airlines, Paul Johnson, had no idea yet just how bad things were about to get. Sarah's report was comprehensive, her evidence irrefutable. The email had been sent. Skylux Airlines was now grounded for the next 48 hours, pending a full investigation. But the real work was just beginning. Sarah knew that the investigation would uncover much more than just one flight crew's mistakes. Skylux had become complacent, and that complacency had trickled down to the very people responsible for ensuring passenger safety. As Sarah leaned back in her chair, she felt a quiet satisfaction wash over her. Her role wasn't to punish, it was to ensure that something like this never happened again. The work was hard, the consequences far-reaching, but it was necessary. And sometimes, the most important thing was simply making sure that those who needed to be held accountable were held to the highest standard. The sound of her email pinging echoed in the quiet office, signaling the beginning of the investigation. And Sarah Miller was ready to see it through.